Mondon, who's a senior lecturer at the University of Bath. And yes, we've done some work together as well. So his research focuses predominantly on the impact of racism and populism on liberal democracies and the mainstreaming of far-right politics through elite discourse. He's got some great books out on these topics, including the latest edition published with Verso called Reactionary Democracy: How Racism and the Populist Far-Right Became Mainstream. And I thoroughly recommend that book. So today's lecture is on the populist hype, the people, and the mainstreaming of the far-right. So yeah, I'll leave it over to Aurelien for a 1-hour lecture.
Thank you, Katie, for this kind introduction, and thank you everyone for being here. It's a pleasure to participate in the ECPS Summer School. So I'm going to be sharing my screen, so you should be able to see it now, which I'll assume is the case. So yeah, so thank you for having me here. I won't be talking so much about populism itself as a concept, but rather I'm going to be talking about the role that populism has played in the mainstreaming of far-right politics. So obviously it will be about populism, but I'm not going to bore you with kind of definitional debates about populism, about whether I stand with the kind of more ideational school or the more discursive one. I mean, just so that there's no kind of, I won't keep you guessing. I do kind of use more the discursive school of populism, but I don't think it's necessarily that important here. And I'll be talking about both schools during this talk. Of course, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to interrupt me, even though we're going to have time after the lecture. But if there's anything unclear, do let me know. So the aim really of this lecture is to provide you with an overview of the more critical literature in the fields of populism and far-right studies. So it's not just about what populism is, but it's also about how we talk about populism. I believe that this is key if we are to fully understand the process of mainstreaming. This lecture builds, of course, on my research, but I wouldn't have been able to do all of that research alone, and therefore it builds a lot on the research undertaken with Aaron Winter, with Jason Glinos, and various others, and of course Katie Brown, who is here. And really, I mean, if you want to hear some very exciting research, please follow Katie, because she has some great stuff coming out, and she's already published some really good things. Someone mentioned the discursive school, the Essex School. If you want some incredible methodological talk, do check out Katie's research. So yeah, to do justice to the topic, obviously, check out the kind of work that I mentioned during this lecture, but also check out the work of the many people that I cite in my research as well, and in my bibliographies, as I wouldn't have been able to kind of do all this research without all these sources. And I'll be circulating a bibliography after the talk as well with the slides. Okay, so let's start then with the first point, which is what is normal, mainstreaming as a heuristic framework. I started working on the mainstreaming of the far right during my PhD in the late 2000s. And even though my first book had the word mainstreaming in it, I didn't really actually define what mainstreaming was. And it's not until I started working with Katie and with Aaron Winter that actually we really kind of sat down and tried to kind of come up with a framework and a heuristic framework that we would be able to apply to the mainstreaming of the far right in particular, but I guess to the mainstreaming in politics in general. So this is work that started first maybe with Aaron Winter and then developed more with Katie Brown. I think I've given you the bibliography in the bibliography that I've sent you. You should have the article from 2021 in the Journal of Political Ideologies. But I'm going to take you through it very quickly. But again, if you have any questions, do let me know. The first thing that we need to do is to put forward a few key elements. Hopefully, most of them will not surprise you, will not shock you, and they are things that you already know. But actually, this is something that we've noticed in our research, not just in our research in academia, but in our research in public discourse as well, which is what we're really interested in, is like teasing out actually how concepts are used within public discourse and how the far right is being mainstream within public discourse, and in particular within the elite. When I'm going to talk about the elite in this talk, what I mean by the elite is the people who have a privileged access to shaping public discourse, such as politicians, of course, the media, but also to some extent academics. We could also look at other actors, such as more cultural actors, but this is not something that I have done. So really, when I'm going to be referring about the elite, I'm going to be referring about politicians, mainstream politicians in particular, mainstream media, and mainstream academia. So the few key elements we need to agree on before we move on to the framework are: the first thing is the mainstreaming of the far right is not new. Even though we've been talking a lot about the mainstreaming of the far right in the 2010s, whether it's about the rise of Donald Trump, the Brexit referendum, the Rassemblement National, and various other countries, which I'm sure you're aware of. We could think about Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, Duterte in the Philippines, and various others. The mainstreaming of the far right is not new. This is something that has been studied historically in the past, whether it's the rise of fascism, of course, but also the mainstreaming of racist theories in the 19th century, or even the mainstreaming of far-right politics in the 1980s and 90s, in particular, if you think about France and Austria as two key places, but also Australia to some extent. The second point is that the mainstream's meaning and position is constructed, contingent, and fluid. We tend to think of the mainstream as something that is obvious, that is just common sense. We all know what the mainstream is, but actually what we argue is that we need to think about the mainstream far more critically if we want to understand the way the far right is being mainstreamed at the moment. Therefore, what is mainstream one day doesn't have to be mainstream the next. If you look, for example, at what's happening in the United States at the moment, you know, everyone thought that abortion had become a right in the United States, and it's just been repealed, and some states are repealing it as well. So you can see that things change, which means also that the mainstream is not essentially good. Right now, for example, some things are mainstream that are not essentially good. And in the past, it was the same. For example, there's a lot of rights that we have gained, that we have won through struggle over the years, decades, and centuries that were not mainstream. Think, for example, about women having the right to vote. For a very long time, it wasn't mainstream for women to have the right to vote. It is now. So again, the mainstream is not essentially good. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. That leads to the next point, which is that progress is not unidirectional or inevitable. We are seeing more and more, actually, the fact, and it's becoming ever more clearly, that progress is not unidirectional and inevitable. As I've said, you know, the debates on abortion in the United States are showing us that, but also the kind of increased securitization in various countries and the crackdown on various rights and liberties that we've acquired through, again, hard-fought struggles. This is showing us that we may be sliding backwards, which is something that for a very long time, I think we ignored, and we believed that we had reached the end of history, as per Fukuyama, even though very quickly he himself realized that this was not the case. Back to the far right, we also need to remember that far right parties can move both ways. They can become more mainstream, they can moderate themselves, they can become more palatable, they can give up on the more extreme side of their politics by, for example, moving away from the more violent sides of their membership, but they can also become more extreme. And so, you know, we need to kind of remember that as well. It's not just a process of far right parties becoming more moderate, they can move both ways. Party politics and discourse can move together, but they do not have to, or not at the same time. So it's not about necessarily, it's not because a far-right party loses an election, then far-right politics disappears from discourse, for example. Now, and I'll come back to that in a second. And finally, the relationship between the elite, public opinion, and the people, and I put the people in inverted commas here, in quotation marks, is premised on uneven power relationships. And this is something that I'm going to come back to in the last section of this talk and in my conclusion. So what we looked at when we looked at mainstreaming in the literature with Katie and with Aaron, and I'm not going to spend too long on this because you can read the article that we've sent you before this lecture. What we've looked at in the literature is generally there is a linear narrative that is adopted, and we felt that this wasn't quite doing justice to the process of mainstreaming. This linear narrative goes something like this, which is, you know, there's discourse which then leads to, you know, appealing to the electorate. So, you know, you change your discourse to appeal to the electorate, and that will determine the outcome of elections. For far-right parties, generally what they do is they try to pursue electoral success. So they try to appeal to a broader base, and therefore they soften their strategy. And this is something that, to be fair, of course, we have seen a lot of far-right parties do, right? Think about the the Front National in France, which softened what was called, mistakenly in my opinion, the process of de-demonization. I've used it in my research, but I'm trying to move away from this because it's actually assuming that there was a demonization, while in fact I think it was a more accurate way of defining the far right as actually something that should be stigmatizing. But that's another issue that I can discuss a bit more later. But the Front National has changed. They moved away from a party that is born of a neo-fascist alliance to something that is moving away from biological racism, from violence, and so on and so forth. So we've seen this happening, but we feel that that doesn't tell the whole story. We also feel that, like, quite often, we also found that the linear narrative applies to mainstream parties, and the way it applies to mainstream parties is that they want to pursue electoral success, and therefore they try to appeal to so-called popular demand, and then they radicalize themselves by, for example, offering to crack down on immigration, or offering the referendum in the UK, for example, about exiting the European Union. We feel that this doesn't do quite justice to it, because it is far too much based on the far right and far right parties and actors and the role they play in mainstreaming. It's also based on the predominance of bottom-up explanations. And finally, it is based on the minimization of discourse. So instead, what we've done is we've come up with a heuristic framework, which looks like this and which is described at length in the article. But really, what we argue with Katie and Aaron is that it is essential to see discourse as key to the process of mainstreaming of far-right politics, and to consider the mainstream as an active agent in this process, rather than as some kind of bulwark, as is too often assumed. I'm sure you've read many times, and maybe you believe it yourself, and we can have a debate afterwards if you want, that the mainstream is necessarily a bulwark against the far-right. What we argue in our research with Katie and Aaron is actually the mainstream can not just not be a bulwark, but can be an enabler of far-right politics. So to avoid these normative assumptions and conclusions, understanding mainstreaming requires a prerequisite acknowledgement that the mainstream is not only constructed, contingent, and fluid, as I said before, but that it is not essentially good, rational, and moderate in and of itself. To emphasize this contingency and the role played by discourse in constructing hegemonic structures, we propose a framework of mainstreaming which challenges the linear narrative that has developed. Instead, our framework underscores the value of engaging with the interconnectedness of different elements and acknowledging the power structures at play. Critically, this framework eliminates the role of mainstream elite actors in shaping public discourse, with strategic effects for elections and a mediatory role with the electorate, but also entailing a cyclical process of normalization, which changes what is and is not acceptable in the mainstream. In a nutshell, what I'm trying to say here is that it is not just about the way far-right parties behave or how they do in electoral politics, but how the mainstream responds to them and props them up, and what kind of narratives this imposes on public discourse. So that's about mainstreaming, and I've gone through it fairly quickly. I haven't checked what time I started this lecture, but Katie, I'm sure you'll wave your hands or tell me when I've overrun, right? But anyway, this was about mainstreaming of far-right politics as a framework. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to link it to populism as a concept and the way populism in particular has been used in public discourse, and then I'm going to try and apply that to a number of case studies to show you how all of this works. So let's turn to the concept of populist hype. The concept of populist hype was first developed with, in collaboration with Jason Glinos. We wrote a working paper in 2015 together, 2016, which eventually was published in a chapter in 2019. Interestingly enough, it was never published as a journal article, because every time we submitted it as a journal to journals, we had an amazingly positive review and a terrible review. Since then, the concept has kind of taken off, and plenty of academics have kind of developed it far more than we did ourselves, and it's going to be almost vindicating, really, to be honest, to see people like Biche Magwashka, Jonathan Dean, Benjamin Declean, Katie to some extent works on this as well, and various others working on populist hype to show that we actually were maybe onto something. And there was a very article recently, maybe a couple of weeks ago, that came out that actually looked at it more in depth, but I cannot remember who it was by. Anyway, it will come back to me and I can share it with you. So First, let me tell you then what the populist hype isn't. I'm telling you this because quite often when I talked about populist hype in the early days with Jason or with various other colleagues, quite often it was what I felt willingly misunderstood, really. And so I came up with a little meme there. So the populist hype is not saying that we should not be concerned about the far right. We are not saying that we shouldn't be worried that the far right is doing whatever electoral results, but the far right is performing well or not so well or anything like that. The far right is deeply concerning, and I'll make this very, very clear from the get-go. My work and the reason why I became an academic is because I am incredibly concerned about the rise of the far right. And even if the far right only gathers 1 out of 10 voters, it's 1 out of 10 voters too many. So I just want to make very clear that the populist hype is not about downplaying the threat of the far right. It is actually about judging the threat of the far right for what it is and not letting off the people who are enabling the far right off the hook. It is also not saying that we should not be concerned about the level of support for the far right generally or within the working class. A lot of my work with Aaron Winter in particular has been on the concept of white working class, which I did the little kind of inverted commas with my hands here, but if you didn't see them, white working class should be in inverted comma because it is a construction. We are not saying in our work that there is no far right support in the white working class. What we're saying in our work is that this support is minimal. Even though it's minimal, it's worrying, but the fact that it's minimal but yet hyped in the media leads to some discourses being pushed through into the mainstream and to the further legitimization of far-right politics. And finally, it is not saying that populism is an entirely useless concept. I've been working on populism for many years, and I still think it's a useful concept. However, the more I work on populism, the more I find it incredibly problematic in public discourse. I think populism has a space in the ECPS, in discussions like ours, in your summer school, where people have the time to talk about what populism is, to think about definitions. But I don't think it's particularly useful in the media these days, for example, because we do not have the space for these definitions, and populism can lead to massive misunderstandings. So it's not just about populism, it's about how we talk about populism. And so before I talk about populist hype, I want to come back to a few texts, which I think were incredibly important way before populist hype and really already touched on some of these issues that Jason and I developed. The first text that I really think is absolutely brilliant and unfortunately was never translated into English is by Annie Kolovald, Le populisme du FN, un dangereux contresens, right-wing populism. And this is a very important book from my point of view, written in 2004 by Annie Kolovald. She wrote it in the aftermath of Jean-Marie Le Pen reaching the second round in the French presidential election of 2002. This is the time when Jean-Marie Le Pen from the 1990s onwards was trying to push the term populism into the mainstream. He wanted the Front National to be called populist rather than extreme right. It led to Marine Le Pen threatening to sue anyone who would call her party extreme right while actually adopting the term populist herself as well. So Jean-Marie Le Pen had been pushing for the term populist to be applied to the Front National. And what Annie Kolovald tells us here is that this is very problematic because the term populism applied to the Front National is blurrier, but also less stigmatizing than the ones that it is meant to replace, such as fascism or extreme right. It also risks stigmatizing what she calls les classes populaires through a semantic link. Les classes populaires it's not popular classes in English. It's more kind of like the working class, if you want, the people, the people as core to democracy, the people who should be pushing democracy. And in a way, it takes us back here to kind of old liberal theories about the fear of the masses and the fear of the plebs and so on and so forth. And what Kolovald tells us is like, if you call Jean-Marie Le Pen populist, you link him to the people through the semantic link. And I'll come back to this later. It was at the time in contradiction with other contemporary approach to Annie Kolovald and, for example, Hans-Georg Betz, who chose the term populist right and sometimes radical populist rights or radical right populism, sorry, because according to him, we had moved away from the radical right. In a way, Kolovald linked to someone you might be more familiar with, which is Kaz Mody's thin ideology. Kaz Mody from very early on, actually, and it was quite an important book for me, his work that he published in 2007, was a very important warning about the uses and misuses of populism and the way populism could actually lead to a misunderstanding and a euphemization of the far right. Kaz Mody told us in 2007 that we should not confuse radical right populism and populist radical right. For Modi, and I quote, "In radical right populism, the primary term is populism, while radical right functions merely to describe the ideological emphasis of this specific form of populism. Populist radical right, on the other hand, refers to a populist form of the radical right." This is very important because what is central to this party's ideology, according to Modi, and I agree with him, is nativism and authoritarianism, not populism, although I would say it's racism and authoritarianism, not nativism, but that's another debate. But where we agree with Kaz Modi here is that if you call a party populist or radical right populist, as opposed to radical right or populist radical right, what you're centering on is the populism. But the populism, according to both major schools of thought in populist studies, whether it's Kaz Modi's ideological approach or the kind of Essex school of kind of discourse analysis, these two schools both stress that actually populism is at the very most an add-on, a thin ideology, or a discourse when it comes to the Essex school. So actually, it is not core to these parties. There is no such thing as a purely populist party, or at least not anymore. Maybe in the 1900s in the United States and Russia, but not anymore. Nowadays, these parties are first and foremost radical right, far right, extreme right, or far left, radical left, whatever you want, but they are not first and foremost populist. Even though Modi's work is used as the basis for much of the mainstream work on populism today, his warning is rarely taken seriously. So you will rarely find an article today that talks about populism that will not cite Kaz Modi, and yet you will find a lot of these articles that will then use populism willy-nilly without taking his warning into account. So why does that matter, you will tell me? Who cares how people use populism and who cares what people use as terms? Well, you're right to some extent. It doesn't really matter as long as people define things carefully, but sadly they don't always. And it matters for a number of reasons. It matters because populism has a long history. As I said in the previous slide, we could think of populist parties that were ideologically populist, potentially the Populist Party in the United States in the late 19th century. Or I would say, from my point of view, the only kind of form of populism that was ideological populism would be the Narodniks in Russia in the late 19th century as well. But that's a debate for another time. It's also important and it matters because populism is now everywhere in our public discourse. In 2017, the Cambridge Dictionary made it the word of the year. And of course, as I'll mention in a second, we have seen it everywhere in our media as well as in academia. And finally, because populism as a word cannot be dissociated from the people. And if it's linked to the people, it is core to democracy. And I'll come back to that a bit later as well. So what we try to do with Jason Glinos is to theorize populist hype. So I'm going to move through this fairly quickly as well, because you can read it for yourself. So what we found is that the rise of so-called right-wing populism is a hyped symptom in a broader crisis. A crisis of political alienation and dissatisfaction, a crisis of that takes its roots in the rise of inequalities, and a crisis that hides the failure of liberal democracies to live up to expectations. There are three dimensions to populist hype. The first is the exaggeration of the results of the far right. Quite often we tend to exaggerate the results of the far right and downplay actually what is happening behind the scene. I've done a lot of work, for example, on the rise of the Front National in France, and in particular the 2002 election when Jean-Marie Le Pen got to the second round. And in my work, what I try to show is that actually in 2002, Jean-Marie Le Pen was stagnating. He was not getting any more votes than he had in 1995 or in 1988. What happened instead was the collapse of mainstream parties. I've done quite a bit of work with Aaron Winter as well on the United States and the UK, where we showed that actually both Trump and the Brexit referendum can be downplayed in terms of the kind of popular appeal that both of them had, and I'm happy to discuss that in the question time if you want. There is also an exaggeration of the political role attributed to so-called right-wing populist parties and movements by implying that they are the main alternative to the status quo. You can think, for example, of a recent election in France where Marine Le Pen had been almost groomed for 5 years to be the alternative to Emmanuel Macron, so that Emmanuel Macron could ask the left to join him to defeat Marine Le Pen, and then turned against them during the legislative elections. And finally, a tendency to describe the rise of so-called right-wing populism in apocalyptic tones that signal a threat to democracy as such. we have to defeat right-wing populism. Otherwise, we will lose democracy, as if there were no other issues in democracy than so-called right-wing populism. So in a way, what we argue is that populist hype shouldn't be downplayed. Like populism and right-wing populism and the far right shouldn't be downplayed. They are real concerns, but they are just symptoms of the crisis of democracy. They are just one of the symptoms of the crisis of democracy. And so in a way, populist hype, when it puts this symptom as the entire kind of crisis, is a diversion away from the failures of our current liberal order and the current liberal order upholding democracy as such. It sees populism as necessarily anti-pluralist, which of course is ridiculous if you work on the left and left-wing populism, if you work on political parties such as Syriza or Podemos, for example, or other people who are left-wing and have been called populists. They are not necessarily anti-pluralist. The far right is anti-pluralist. Left-wing populism doesn't have to be. And doing so, it restricts our democratic horizon to populist and anti-populist alternatives. Therefore, it's either the status quo or the populist evil. And therefore, it props up a status quo, which in fact is enabling the far right and sending us down that slippery slope. If you want to read more on anti-populism in particular, I really encourage you to read the work of Yanis Stavrakakis and many of his colleagues, and Anton Jager as well. So now let me show you how populist hype works in practice. And this is the work that Katie and I have done together. This is based on Katie's research methods, which are a mixed method of discourse theory, critical discourse studies, and corpus linguistics. So what we try to do, and what Katie tried to do in kind of coming up with this kind of mixed method approach, is to kind of mix the kind of great elements of discourse theory in a way, and what discourse theory can tell us about the bigger picture and hegemony in particular, with a more kind of like quantitative approach through critical discourse analysis, and in particular corpus linguistics, to kind of test out actually the broader theory. And this is something that we feel has worked very well for this project, but also for Katie's PhD. So what we did is a study of Guardian articles from the 20th of November 2018 and 20th of November 2019. Why did we choose these dates? Because the Guardian on the 20th of November 2018 launched a 6-month series on the new populism. We ended up looking at it for over a year because the Guardian kept publishing articles in that, as part of that series for longer than the 6 months that they had planned in the first instance. In total, we found 1,548 distinct articles containing populists. So populism, populist, populists, and so on and so forth. In total, there were 3,996 uses of populists in these 1,548 articles. The article that you have here on the slide is the first article that came out in the series. In a way, it justifies the series. I'm not going to tell you who the author is, because it's not particularly interesting. It's like the author is actually an academic who is a very serious academic, quite a good academic, but I don't think it shows the title. Quite often in the media, the titles and subtitles are chosen by editors and not by the writers. It's very rare when authors actually choose their title, and certainly in my experience in The Guardian in particular, this is not the case. So this is why I didn't include the name of the author here, because I think it's more an editorial choice than an authorial choice. But I think this is absolutely telling about where The Guardian went totally wrong in what could have been a very useful series. So the title, "Why is Populism Suddenly All the Rage?" ? And the subtitle, "In 1998, about 300 Guardian articles mentioned populism. In 2016, 2,000 did. What happened?" Just think about it for a second. What happened in The Guardian that made them talk so much about populism? Is it that the people, again in inverted commas, in quotation mark, is it that the people every day they go and knock on the door of The Guardian and they ask them to talk about populism? Or is it editors who maybe made a choice to talk more about populism? And what's fascinating about this entire series is there's hardly no reflection about The Guardian's own responsibility in hyping populism, in talking about populism when they shouldn't. And what I'm going to show you now, which is based on the article that we wrote with Katie, so if you want more detail, you can go to the article, is actually how The Guardian shaped and hyped populism, and then turned around and say, what's going on? Why is populism suddenly all the rage? As if they have no responsibility in this. So The first things that we found in our article is a process of agenda setting and deflection. As Maxwell Macomb said, the media does not tell the public what to think, but it can influence what they think about. I quote, "Journalists focus our attention and influence our perceptions of what are the most important issues of the day. More precisely," and I quote again, "the public uses these salient cues from the media to organize their own agendas and decide which issues are more important. Over time, the issues emphasized in news reports become the issues regarded as most important among the public. The agenda of the news media becomes, to a considerable degree, the agenda of the public." This can take place through various processes such as priming, framing, and so on. I don't really have the time to go through that, but you can read the article if you want to know more. What we found quite fascinating again here is that if the newspaper turned to populism, it was assumed almost without any self-reflection that it was because A, populist parties and politics were on the rise, B, that their readership wanted to read about populism, and C, that the coverage of populism had no impact on populist parties and politics and their potential rise and fall. Of course, media studies have suggested that editorial choices firmly rest with editorial boards rather than with the people, and that the power to set the agenda also remains within such spheres. And yet the Guardian acted as if it were an objective and removed actor, whose practice could not be subject to a critical appraisal as if removed from power. I feel like, Katie, how long have I been speaking for? Could you let me know? I feel like I may need to skip a little.
I think it's about 30 minutes.
Okay, yeah, I might skip a little because you can read all of this in the article anyway. So the first thing that we found was the agenda setting and deflection. To summarize it, is the fact that The Guardian, of course, is a key actor in agenda setting. It is a mainstream party in the UK, a mainstream newspaper in the UK. But there is a process of deflection whereby The Guardian says that it is not their responsibility. They refuse to take responsibility for their power in shaping the agenda, in shaping public discourse. And you can see, for example, the way they've given platforms to people who could be considered, far-right actors, such as Steve Bannon, of course, and I'll come back to him in a second, but also Matthew Goodwin, who has proven recently that he should not necessarily be given these kind of platforms, particularly on a left-wing newspaper, and we can come back to that later if you want to. The second kind of elements that we found in this article are euphemization and trivialization, which again are linked to this process of populist hype. This relates to the overuse of populism either to replace more accurate or derogatory qualifiers, which is euphemization, so qualifiers such as extreme right, far right, and so on, or to describe a wide range of unrelated phenomena which devalue its meaning, which is the process of trivialization. A great example of euphemization is the one you can see here on the screen, which is an article published in October 2019 about the election in Thuringia, where the far-right AFD finished second. The party is described as anti-immigrant populists, with a choice of nomination serving a euphemizing function. The aspect of populism is centralized as opposed to anti-immigration, which in fact should more accurately be described as racism. It's quite interesting as well that here the AFD candidate Bjorn Åke was probably one on the more extreme right of the party, and in fact he had been it was, I think, legal at the time to call him a fascist, according to a court case in Germany. Beyond the persistent patterns of euphemization, populist is also used more broadly to label a vast array of phenomena and is itself described in a huge variety of ways, a process which has a trivializing effect. What we've seen in our research on the Guardian series on the new populism is, for example, an article that described a jazz musician as a fervent jazz populist, with no other mention of the term and no explanation as to what the word referred to. Another musician is referred to as being in a sweet spot between Ed Sheeran populists and the indie faithful. We also have talks about fluffy populism and various other kind of weird euphemizing and trivializing uses of the term. What's more about this is that this decontextualized application is prevalent in the data. Despite roughly averaging 3 occurrences per text, there's 1,037 articles, more than two-thirds of the corpus, that use populists only once across the article, which is quite telling again, because, if you've been interested in populism, you know that it is a very debated term, right? And here what we see in The Guardian that is doing a series on populism is that they use populism willy-nilly without defining it well enough. The last element is amplification. In addition to then the other elements that I've talked about, The Guardian has participated in the amplification of the far right by giving them further credence as well as the necessary space to be heard. And I'm coming back here to Steve Bannon, because this came out on the second day of the series. And the first few articles that came out in this series were mostly on Steve Bannon, even though at the time Steve Bannon was completely failing in his enterprise to break through in European politics. And yet they did 4 articles on Steve Bannon. And in these articles, what's fascinating is, like, if you look at the headlines here, Steve Bannon's far-right Europe operation undermined by election laws. So already it's telling you that it's not working very well, but then they still give an interview to Steve Bannon to be able to say, I want to drive a stake through Brussels. And then, you know, there's lots of kind of other articles that tell us more about all of this. And Steve Bannon is given a lot of space to push his extremely violent and far-right ideas. And so all of this, in a way, and I'm sorry, I've moved through this quite quickly, but I want to kind of move on to the next part as well and have the time to talk about everything that I had planned, which was probably far too much, but we shall see, and I'm digressing, so I shouldn't. All of this leads to a process of legitimization and mainstreaming that I've already talked about. And you can see that very clearly in this headline here: Hillary Clinton, Europe must curb immigration to stop right-wing populists. And you will tell me, but maybe Hillary Clinton is right. You know, maybe the far right is tapping into what has been called, and I put again inverted commas here or quotation marks, legitimate grievances of the quotation mark left behind of the quotation mark white working class. Maybe the far right and its ideas are popular after all. You know, maybe we are reaching a breaking point. Maybe people are tired of immigration. Maybe people think they are real grievances there. And in fact, yes, there are people who think that there are real grievances, but these people are far-right leaders such as Nigel Farage and Donald Trump. So let's listen to Nigel Farage in 2016, who wrote in The Telegraph, which shows, of course, the kind of access he has to again, shaping public discourse through mainstream media. This is a month before the US election, when Donald Trump was elected. This is a few months after the Brexit referendum. And the quote is from Nigel Farage: "The similarities between the different sides in this election are very like our own recent battle. As the rich get richer and big companies dominate the global economy, voters all across the West are being left behind. The blue-collar workers in the valleys of South Wales, angry with Chinese steel dumping, voted Brexit in their droves. In the American Rust Belt, traditional manufacturing industries have declined, and it is to these people that Trump speaks very effectively." This kind of narrative has been lapped up by most of the mainstream media, including the mainstream media on the left. If you look at, and I don't have them here, but I could send them to you if you want, or you can read it in, like in my work and the work of others. If you look at kind of headlines at the time, it's all about like Trump was elected because of the white working class, because of the voters from the Rust Belt. Brexit was because of the white working class in the UK, of the North, and so on. Think about the Red Wall in the UK today and the way the Red Wall is talked about. Of course, this is completely ridiculous from an electoral point of view, from a data point of view. In fact, the bulk of the Brexit vote comes from wealthy people. It also comes from the south of the UK, and a big chunk comes from Scotland. That's right, from Scotland, but actually voted to remain. A big chunk of the Brexit vote comes from there as well. Same with Trump. Trump, in fact, did the worst with the poorest sections of the American electorate. Hillary Clinton beat him in most of these sections, and he did very, very well with the wealthier sections, and he did even better with the wealthier sections the second time around in 2020. It is also worth remembering that Donald Trump was elected with only 25% of the registered vote in the United States, and it's worth keeping in mind that, you know, the registered vote in the United States is very problematic because many people have been driven off the registers and would usually be Democrat voters. So why have we lapped up what Nigel Farage, and before I move on, why have we lapped up what Nigel Farage and Donald Trump are telling us? Why have we lapped up the fact that they are the spokespeople of the working class? I mean, look at them in their golden elevator. How incredibly condescending to think that actually poor people will turn to these guys and be like, yes, they're defending my interests. It's incredibly condescending, and yet we've lapped it up. But you will tell me, yeah, but people are still, worried about immigration, and this is why we need to cover populism, because, that's one of the issues that's dividing, that's dividing us. And, if you look at the biggest issues, according to Ipsos Mori, you can see that immigration was quite high in 2015, and then it kind of fizzles out. And what I've tried to do in a way, building on Ipsos Mori and using also the Eurobarometer, is come up with something slightly different, which is, why are people worried about immigration, and when are people worried about immigration? And what you can see here is already with Ipsos Mori, you can make a few kind of a few guesses about why and when people are worried about immigration. You can see that it rises up and down. And it doesn't mean that there is more or less immigration. Look, for example, at the Brexit vote. When the Brexit vote happens, concerns about immigration completely disappear, even though by that stage, immigration is still open and Europeans can still move to the UK freely. So what I looked at is the Eurobarometer. And I looked at the Eurobarometer because instead of asking just one question the way Ipsos Mori does, which is what are the most important issues facing Britain today, the Eurobarometer asks 3 different questions. What do you think are the 2 most important issues facing our country at the moment? What do you think are the 2 most important issues facing the EU at the moment? And what do you think are the 2 most important issues facing you personally at the moment? People then are given 12 to 15 different answers. They can say crime, immigration, cost of living, terrorism, education, pensions, energy, the environment, and so on and so forth. And they have to pick 2 of them. They can also make up another one if they want to. What you can see here is the answer in the EU, France, and the UK about what do you think are the 2 most important issues facing our country at the moment. And you can see that there's a rise in every country in 2015-16. This is, of course, the time in the UK where it's the highest of the referendum on the EU. So, of course, at that time, the campaign, some work has been done on this by colleagues at King's College, who have shown that actually media coverage of the campaign was predominantly focused on first the economy, second immigration, but most of the headlines and front pages were on immigration, and most of these were covering immigration negatively. And so you can think why people were thinking about immigration when the Brexit referendum happened. But of course, in 2015, other things are happening, 2015-16. We have the so-called refugee crisis, which leads to a lot of talk about immigration again, even though France or the UK were not particularly touched by this crisis. And you also have, of course, a string of terrorist attacks, in particular in France, which again is linked to immigration. So when you look at this question, what do you think are the 2 most important issues facing our country at the moment? Immigration is quite high. If you look at a 10-year average, this is what happens in the UK. With a 10-year average, you can see that immigration does indeed seem to be the main issue in the UK. Crime that I've put in yellow and terrorism in orange, you can see are quite high as well, and they're usually related to immigration when people think about them. What's fascinating, as I said, about the Eurobarometer is that they ask them, the same people, the same respondents, they ask them, according to you personally, what are the 2 biggest issues you are facing at the moment? And this is where immigration is. This is exactly the same scale, 0 to 50, 0 to 50. What you can see is here, immigration rises up to almost 45% in the UK and to a more than 35% average in the EU. If you look at personally, it reaches 10% only once, and it's in 2016 in the UK. So why is it that people do not care so much about immigration when it's about them personally, and they care so much about immigration when it's about their country? What you can see here is the 10-year average. Look at where immigration is and look at what people care about when they think about themselves. Rising prices, just imagine where it would be right now with the cost of living crisis. Health and social security, the financial situation of your household, pensions, the economic situation in our country, unemployment, the education system, and so on and so forth. Well, there's no easy answer to that, right? And I'm not saying that people don't care about immigration necessarily. What I'm saying is that people care about immigration also when they are told to think beyond themselves. When people think about their day-to-day lives, their concerns are not the immigrant, because the immigrant is not an immigrant. The immigrant might be the neighbor, might be unemployed, might be the pharmacist, might be the cleaner, might be the lawyer, might be someone else. It's just someone who is also struggling, who is also sending their kids to school, who is also shopping at the same shop, who is also doing exactly what they're doing, right? But when, of course, they have to think beyond themselves, when they have to think about their imagined community, their knowledge needs to be mediated. All of our knowledge needs to be mediated, right? Even us who study politics, we don't understand all the ins and outs of political systems, all the political issues and things like that. We have to rely on someone to give us some knowledge of all of these things and to make this knowledge reachable and understandable, because we don't have the time to learn all of these things. And so we trust various sources, right? And, you know, some people trust religious institutions, some people trust their workplaces, their trade unions, their family, their friends. But of course, more and more we trust the media and social media. But in social media, the legacy media, the old media still has massive power. And so that takes us back to agenda setting. The media doesn't tell you what to think, but it certainly tells you what to think about. And this really shows you that, you know, this is very much the case. So what we need to think about here, really, when we think about populism, when you think about populism and legitimate grievances, when you think about populism and the mainstreaming of the far right, we need to think about opinion polls and how they do not reflect the people, and how electoral results might not necessarily reflect the people as the demos of democracy. They create it instead. They create a people to be followed, a people to be blamed, and a people to legitimize reactionary and elitist positions and politics. A people to be followed, just like The Guardian. Remember that headline of The Guardian, why is populism all the rage? In 1996, we had like a couple of articles on populism. In 2016, we had thousands. What happened? You know, as if it was the people's fault that we are talking about immigration, as if it's the people's fault that we are platforming far-right actors, as if it's the people's fault that we're closing borders and putting barbed wires and so on and so forth. We are blaming the people, we are following them. And finally, a people to legitimize reactionary and elitist positions and politics. This has serious democratic consequences. It legitimizes the elitist and far-right politics. It invisibilizes and silences minorities, of course, who are never given the right to speak. It exculpates the elites of their responsibility in policy and decision-making, but also in shaping public discourse and setting the agenda. And finally, it obscures uneven power relationships in public discourse. So to conclude, as I feel that I'm kind of running out of time now, we need to think about the mainstreaming of the far right and the role populism plays in the mainstreaming of the far right, and the way we talk about populism plays in the mainstreaming of the far right in a chicken or egg situation. Are the rise and normalization of far right discourse far right driven, or are they mainstream driven? Well, they're probably a bit of both, but we cannot lend the mainstream of the hook. Think about, for example, Emmanuel Macron. Think about Boris Johnson. Think about Keir Starmer in the UK. Think about, you know, politicians in most of the countries where the far right has been on the rise. What have mainstream actors been doing? Most of the time, what they've been doing is giving platforms to the far right, using the far right as a diversion, tapping into far right grievances, and therefore legitimizing them as they are setting the agenda. Which leads me to the second point: are the rise and normalization of the far right people-driven or elite-driven? Is it really the elite following the people because the people want more authoritarianism and they want more far-right politics? Or is it actually the elite who are deciding to platform more far-right politics and impose them on their people as a diversion away from the key concerns of the population? These are, of course, difficult questions to answer, but from my point of view and shared by many of my co-authors, they are key if we are to take the rise of far-right politics seriously. So I know I strayed a little bit away from populism, but I hope it still made sense about how we need to kind of take seriously our use of populism so that we don't play into actually popularizing the far right by mislabeling it as populist. So thank you so much for listening. I hope it wasn't too quick, and I hope it was clear enough.